Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In this bonus author interview, I sit down with historian Paul Carter and talk about his most recent book, Richard Nixon, California's Native Son. If you're a fan of the show, then you know I love things that complicate the narrative. And the narrative usually with Richard Nixon is Richard Nixon, Watergate, full stop. But the reality is that Nixon was a lot more than that. And I think even in light of recent contemporary politics, he deserves a reevaluation for not only how he approached some of his mistakes, but also for some of the really important things that he did, both as president and in the years leading up to being president, that put our country on a good path. But I'll let the interview speak for itself. As always, the link is in the show notes. If you'd like to pick up a copy of the book, it's available right now. And so without further ado, here's the interview. So as I mentioned just moments ago, I'm sitting down here with historian Paul Carter, and we're going to talk about Richard Nixon, because he has a new book out, aptly titled in such a way. And I think, let me tell you at a base level why I like the book. I like the book because it's not just, Richard Nixon = Watergate, end full stop. And that's where the story ends. I think, as we'll kind of talk about when we go through this, there's a lot more to this person than one incident. And I think even his reaction to that incident tells us a lot about him. As I was reading the book, I was kind of reflecting a lot on his character as a person. And that's a lot of what I want to focus on today with the questions. But I kind of want to start out by getting our setting, because Richard Nixon is Californian, but I don't know that the California that Richard Nixon grew up in would be as familiar to people who are listening to this in 2023. Can you kind of explain to me what California was like when Richard Nixon was young and how different that is from our modern idea? Because I think we have to get that to sort of get the ball rolling.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And it's a great opportunity to talk about Richard Nixon's, California life. And you have to remember, if you go to Southern California now, which is where I live, you can go almost from Santa Barbara to the border of, Mexico, and it's just one community after another. But back when Richard Nixon was born, like Yorba Linda, it was a wide open town, and nothing more than a wide open town. There was 350 people in the city of Yorba Linda when he was 7 years old in 1920, and each of the communities, whether it be Yorba Linda or Whittier or Pomona or Pasadena, they were balkanized in a way where you would have thousands of acres of orchards and wide open spaces in between those little communities. And the people that inhabited the area at the time were self-sufficient and self-reliant, and they were really coming from the East Coast, which was much more populous, and staking it out on their own. And had like this independence and self-reliance about them. And that was the culture that he was raised in, which was, as you noted, so different than it is today.
Yeah, and I think it's just it's always important to ground ourselves in history and in the historical period, because, when we say Southern California today, people probably picture a very urban environment, and rightly so to a large extent. That's not the case when he's growing up. And the self-reliant idea is something that, as I was reading the book, just kept coming up again and again and again in my mind, of this person who's raised, we would think more today, we'd probably picture someone in Oklahoma, Kansas, on like a small community, kind of tucked away, set back. And his faith's a big part of that, because a lot of people might not realize that, Richard Nixon was born Quaker. And that's That's also extremely unique. So what did that mean for him growing up in his early years, and how do we see the influence of at least the faith he was raised in throughout his life and maybe even later in life?
Well, the Quaker faith was, it was really the center of the social life for young Richard Nixon growing up. Everything revolved around the church. When he was in Yorba Linda, his father built the first church in town, which was the Quaker church that he attended. And then when he moved to Whittier in 1922, when he was 9 years old, they ended up out in East Whittier, which was out in the country again. And it was across the street from the East Whittier Friends Church. And everyone would attend church all day on Sundays. There was a morning Sunday school with a morning church service after. Then in the afternoon, there was Christian Endeavor. And then in the late afternoon, they had an evening service, which was more akin to a traditional service that you might think of now. And so much of his lifestyle traits can be seen in the way he approached church and was raised in the church. The morning service oftentimes would be a quiet service where you would go in and you'd meditate. And the church, when it would make decisions, it would require that it be something, whatever the decision was, that they talked all the way through it, and then everyone agreed unanimously. So they considered all proposals. And really, it was a situation where people weren't afraid to think and express themselves and meditate in front of each other and, analyze issues, which is what really Nixon was all about throughout all of his life. Everyone talks about how intelligent he was, and he was, but also being comfortable thinking in front of others and being comfortable exploring the whole range of issues when you're thinking about what to do. It's all related back to his Quaker church and his Quaker beliefs. And really the Quaker religion is that, there's a spark of good, a divine light in every individual, and that every individual has to make their own decisions and be respectful of others' decisions. And it's really interesting how you see that come up throughout his life.
Yeah, the deliberative nature of Richard Nixon was something that when I read the chapter and we're talking about his early life and talking about his Quaker faith, and then as we come back in subsequent chapters, especially when he's trying to decide, I guess I'll say his own path, his own way, when he's trying to decide, do I run for this particular office or don't I? He's very willing to solicit advice from the people whose lives matter and who are important to him in his context, his close family, his friends, his associates. And he struck me as someone who was willing to listen to the different opinions. And I saw that coming back from the earlier sections on his faith. So that is one of the, I thought, was the biggest takeaways from how he was raised, to think about an issue, not just from one side, but from all sides. And I think it's important to remember that with Nixon, especially when we talk about Watergate later on. But I am interested about him as a person. He's roughly a modern figure. So we can talk about how he was as a person in ways that, we can't about Charlemagne or, I don't know, Caesar Augustus or someone. Like, that's just not possible. But with Richard Nixon, he seems like to have been a really impressive, especially young person. I remember the part in the chapter he got his first job out of law school after just one real brief interview. Like he must have been someone that you walked away with feeling like he's made a very good impression. So I wondered if you could talk about just his personality a little bit. And we can stay in his younger years if we want to try to keep up the chronological standpoint.
If you look at his whole upbringing, you can see that he just as you mentioned, he had success after that one interview. And that was really the way he was in his life. He was successful in everything he participated in, whether it be debate in elementary school. He was 8th grade class president and spoke at his graduation. He was very active in high school, and in college he was extremely active and very successful. And then when he was a young lawyer, in addition to getting his job at Wingert and Bewley, which was the premier law firm in town, he is so dynamic in so many different ways in civic opportunities. He's president of the 2030 Club, and under his leadership, it has its largest increase in membership ever. He goes to other service clubs and gives talks. He gives talks on pre-election issues or ballot measures. He is Duke Alumni Association president. He's on the Whittier College Board of Trustees. He's a program chairman for the Junior Chamber of Commerce. He teaches a course in practical law at Whittier College. He's really a person that is deeply invested in his community and volunteering his time in addition to his hard work as an attorney, and even having himself appointed as the Whittier Assistant City Attorney and doing that work in addition to his legal work. And during that same period, and when you talk about his legal career in Whittier, you're really only talking about from June of 1937 until December of 1941. So it's really about 4.5 years. And it's incredibly busy and successful. He even went into the frozen orange juice business, which in the 1930s was a pioneering endeavor. But you see a person that's extremely active and extremely engaged in his community and very, very hardworking and diligent.
And I think he is civically minded. And I want to draw this distinction here because I don't think there's this sense that I think sometimes comes out from Richard Nixon of this, very sort of this image of this very, let's say shady, almost Machiavellian political worker. And I don't get the sense in these earlier chapters when you were talking about his commitment to civic life, I don't get the sense that this was a box checking sort of ambition driven commitment. In other words, he wasn't simply doing that to lay the groundwork so that he could say that he did all these things when he ran for office. I get the sense that he really felt passionately about being connected to civic life in his community. Do you agree, or could you give me an example? That's what I came away with.
I absolutely agree. And in fact, if you look at his goals that he wrote when he was in the 8th grade, he wrote out what he wanted to do in life. And he basically wrote out that he wanted to graduate from Whittier High School and Whittier College and go to law school and become an attorney so that he could be of some good to the people. And he basically lived that goal throughout his life. And when he was in high school, he started doing debate on a competitive level, and he would participate in like the constitutional law oratorical contests that were put on by the Los Angeles Times. And he really studied the Constitution in preparing for those competitions, and he came to the determination that the Constitution was the finest document struck by the hand of man. And between his desire to want to be as some good of the people and his high regard for the Constitution, you see that this is really something innate within him, that he wants to work on behalf of others. If you even look at when he's at Whittier College. Now, Richard Nixon was known to be very talented musically, and so I'm sure that he was very rhythmic, but he was not known to be someone that would go out and dance and like to dance. And when he was at Whittier College, he was a senior. Whittier College didn't allow dancing, and they were firmly against dancing. There had been a guy in town that was a bank teller, and he tried to start a movement to allow dancing, and the president of Whittier College was so incensed with him that he had him fired from his job, and then they ran him out of the church. And then along comes Nixon in his senior year, and he persuades the school and the Board of Trustees to allow dancing, even though he's really not someone that is into dancing himself, but he knows that his fellow students want to do it. And he knows it's quite frankly in the best interest of the school to allow it on a local level because the students will go elsewhere and dance. And it's an example of how he's doing something that he's doing it for others when he doesn't even have a very, it's not like he grew up a dancer.
Yeah, and the point about his reverence for the Constitution, I think, is incredibly important, especially when we come back and evaluate him later on. But so after the end of World War II, Nixon runs for office for the first time, I believe, in 1946 in the book. And the takeaway that I got from this section as I was reading it was I just kept thinking over and over again, here is one of these people, one of these human beings who just is unwilling to lose. And he is going to work so hard to really pull what is, maybe a serious upset, but he's able to just outwork all of his contemporaries. I wonder if you agree with that, and if you could maybe expand on it. So that was what I felt as I was reading it.
He absolutely worked and earned that victory. And the common perceptions of Nixon are that he always wanted to be a Northeasterner, and he wanted to be part of the whole Northeastern establishment, and that he had a chip on his shoulder because he couldn't go to Harvard or Yale, and he went to Whittier instead, and that he wanted to get a job in a New York law firm after graduating from Duke, and he couldn't get an offer, so he had to return home to lowly Whittier, bitter and disappointed. And it's just nonsense. And this campaign in 1946 is a perfect example of that. First of all, Richard Nixon was offered a job when he graduated from Duke, from a New York law firm, and he turned it down. But if you look at his service at the end of World War II, he's negotiating the termination of war contracts between big business and the government. And he's in New York City. He's at Lower Manhattan doing it. And he's so successful that he's soon negotiating the termination of contracts within 500 miles of New York City. And many of the men that he served in the South Pacific before that with were successful businessmen in New York City. He probably could have written his own ticket in New York City when the war ended and just stayed back there where he was already living at the end of the war. Instead, he chose to come back to Whittier. And if you look at Jerry Voorhees, who was the congressman that he took on, he was a 5-term incumbent Democrat. He was voted as having the third safest seat in the House of Representatives, and he was voted best congressman west of the Mississippi. The Republican Party had taken him on in the prior elections and lost every time, and basically washed their hands of the race against Jerry Voorhees because it was a losing proposition. But Nixon comes out, and there was a group that was called the Committee of 100 that formed to try and find a candidate that could run against Jerry Voorhees. And it was basically primarily composed of people from Whittier and some from Pomona and also Pasadena, because the district spread out throughout that whole area. And they selected Nixon as their candidate, and he did an audition for it and wanted to run. And once he decided to take that on, he was just unfailing in his work ethic, and nobody really thought that he had a chance. And he just went he had coffee meetings where he would go to different people's houses and communities and meet for coffee. He went and he called on all the newspapers in the district. And by the end of the campaign, 26 of the newspapers in the district endorsed him. And he challenged Voorhees to 5 debates. He beat him in each of the 5 debates. And these were debates where, 1,000 people would show up, and they'd have to put speakers in the parking lot for people to be in the overflow crowd to hear, which you don't even hear of people that interested today being involved in a congressional race or interested in a congressional race. And it was just sheer hard work and campaigning. And he ended up even beating Jerry Voorhees in Jerry Voorhees' hometown of Diamond Bar. And it was just, like you pointed out, that hard work that carried the day.
Yeah. And so then, after serving successfully in Congress, he winds up, maybe rather unexpectedly, being selected to be running mate for Eisenhower. That's maybe not expected, but I'm curious as to, what was the thought process that went into Richard Nixon being chosen as certainly the running mate of the most famous living general to come out of World War II. And what did Nixon bring to the table that made him a good choice?
When Nixon was elected in 1946 to Congress, he then ran for re-election. And back in those days, you could do what was called cross-filing. So a Republican could run in the Democrat primary and a Democrat could run in the Republican primary. And that was a typical thing that the candidates would do. So he actually won re-election in 1948 by carrying the Democrat vote. And it gave him an opportunity where he didn't have to campaign as hard in 1948 because he really had no significant challenger. And at that time, he was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and you have this whole issue of Alger Hiss and his testimony in front of the committee and whether or not he had perjured himself, which Richard Nixon proves that Alger Hiss had perjured himself and apparently had been providing information to the Soviet Union, or at least been a supporter of the Communist Party in America, which up until that point really was not a big issue. The bigger issue in like 1946 was running for or providing for GI benefits and dealing with the population explosion and dealing with the housing crunch. And so that whole issue of the Alger Hiss case really brought Nixon to national prominence. The Republicans lost control of the House, and Richard Nixon was faced with, do I stay in the House of Representatives in 1950, or do I try and move on to the United States Senate? Sheridan Downey was the sitting Democrat senator from California, and Nixon decided to challenge him in the general election. Helen Gahagan Douglas was also a congresswoman from Southern California in a neighboring district, and she decided to challenge Sheridan Downey on the Democrat ticket. She got into such a nasty fight with Sheridan Downey that he ended up withdrawing from the race, and there was a tremendous amount of fighting on the Democrat side, and Richard Nixon came in, and most of the Democrats supported him in that race, and he ended up winning that Senate race in 1950 in the largest landslide of any Senate candidate in the country, which really brought him to national prominence and showed how strong he was as a candidate, which put him in Eisenhower's, scopes, so to speak. Then they went and they had the convention, because you also had Earl Warren was the governor of California. And the delegates really supported Nixon and Eisenhower at the 52 delegation or 52 convention, and all of this together with also, General Eisenhower was older at the time, maybe not compared to today's age of presidents, but back in those days, he certainly, had already had basically a career and was a hero of World War II. And so Nixon brought youth and vigor and political skills and an incredibly strong work ethic to the ticket that was all very appealing to General Eisenhower.
And I think what's interesting then is obviously Eisenhower emerges victorious. Eisenhower and Nixon win the election. And Eisenhower is, of course, going to win re-election, as I'm sure everyone who's listening to this knows. But most VPs throughout American history are relatively forgettable, relatively speaking. They don't do much other than potentially try to use the office as a stepping stone in most cases to succeed to the presidency at some point. I was struck by how different Nixon was in this role, that he seemed to see this position as a position from which he could do genuine good right now, not waiting for his turn, so to speak. And one of the other areas that I found it particularly interesting, and I'm guessing some listeners will be surprised by this, but by his civil rights work. Most people probably know him as sort of the law and order presidential candidate from the 70s, but his role in the 50s is very different, and I thought fascinating. So I was wondering if you could talk about that for a second.
Nixon always had, from his youngest days, a very open mind towards civil rights. He would talk about how, as a young man growing up in the Quaker Church, there was never any talk of any prejudice or holding anything against anybody based on the color of their skin, or even their whether it was a male or a female. And when he was at Whittier College, and he was one of the guys that formed a new society to compete against the existing Franklins. He had a teammate on the football team with him that was an African American, and he invited him to join their new Orthogonian organization. And when he was in World War II in the South Pacific, fighting with his fellow servicemen against the Japanese, he was really with a melting pot of people, and they were Italians, Mexicans, Irishmen, all different people, and he reflected on how he really saw that everyone was equal and worked together, and he didn't view. He viewed racial issues as a moral problem in addition to a legal problem, and he didn't view race relations as a political issue in terms of saying that it was a Democrat or Republican issue. He always looked at it as a moral issue and what was right and what was wrong. And so he always was a proponent of advancing the rights of all people, and he did that as in his service as vice president by meeting Martin Luther King Jr. when he was in Ghana, recognizing its independence, and proposing along with Eisenhower and helping support the 1957 Civil Rights Act and really pushing that through. And interestingly, in terms of women's rights, when Richard Nixon was elected vice president, one of the duties of the vice president was to deliver the different proclamations and resolutions that are passed by the various states to the Senate floor. And so he had a lady in his office that had been with him from his Senate years, and he gave her the duty of delivering these proclamations and resolutions to the Senate floor. And when she went to do it, the Senate Sergeant at Arms told her the job had to be done by a man. And so she came back to the office and she told that to Nixon, and he got up from his desk and he walked down to the Senate chamber and he told the Senate Sergeant at Arms that Loie Gaunt was the woman from his office that he assigned the task, that she was capable of performing the task, and that she was going to be performing that task from that day forward, which she did. And so he really conducted himself in a way where he stood for equality of all people.
And I think a lot of this is also just we talked about it at the beginning, but his willingness to be deliberative, to listen to different people of different sides and come to what was in many ways sort of a natural conclusion about the capabilities of different individuals who are more than able to perform these tasks. This jumps forward a little bit, but as you were talking, I was remembering one of my favorite Nixon anecdotes to talk about, and again, it has nothing to do with Watergate, is actually when he's president, after the Kent State shootings that happened, because, and a lot of people don't know this, but he went out. There were massive protests in Washington afterwards, and he left the White House, went down, and spent really an entire overnight sitting with the protesters and listening to their complaints. I mean, that's just crazy. You can't imagine a president nowadays doing that. That would be bananas. I mean, it's very different than some of the images that we get. But I see this as sort of a consistent character trait. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I also agree with you that people would look at it as bananas. And, the media really didn't know how to even deal with what he was doing, and they almost kind of portrayed it as him dissembling in front of their very eyes, whereas it wasn't that at all. It was him recognizing the humanity of the situation and wanting to connect with the people and let them know that he was interested in how they viewed things, and he was interested in sharing with them how he viewed things. And it was extremely human of him to do that, and it really was reflective of the way he looked at life. And another example of him having this willingness to take a look at different viewpoints that he might not agree with. He grows up as a Quaker. Quakers generally are pacifists, and they don't subscribe to participating in war or armed conflict. And although historically we have had many Quakers, like Nathaniel Greene was in George Washington's army, and he was a Quaker. And he was a general in George Washington's army. But Richard Nixon, as a Quaker, volunteers for service during World War II. And in the 1960s, we still had conscription. We had Vietnam going on. And he heard about this proposal by a guy named Martin Anderson, which was to have an all-voluntary military. And Richard Nixon really didn't agree with it. but he thought it was interesting conceptually. And so when he became president, he appointed a study group to analyze it. And he even appointed a high-ranking military person to oversee it that he thought probably would disagree with the whole idea. And they looked at it, they studied it, they analyzed it, they really dug into it, and they ultimately concluded that an all-voluntary military force was in our country's best interest and recommended that to the president. And then he endorsed their decision, and he brought us the all-voluntary military that we now have and ended conscription. And it started off as an idea that he was not in favor of. But it shows you that ability to fully analyze issues and bring them to our country.
Yeah, I think that sort of deliberative quality is just, it's not something, at least in contemporary politics, that is oftentimes seen as a strength anymore. If you are debating something, oftentimes that's seen as flip-flopping or being, wishy-washy. But for Nixon, it really was one of his key strengths, at least in my opinion. Well, let's go back to the 1960 election, because I think that tells us a little bit more about him as well. So he cruises through the Republican primary, no problem there. And then he's going to face, as we know, John F. Kennedy. All right. John F. Kennedy comes to the race with baggage. Some personal baggage, some things that, some people around Nixon are saying we should take advantage of this. And he doesn't want to do it, though. And I thought that episode was really interesting because it told us a lot about Nixon that, again, I don't think jives with the oft-presented view of Nixon as the political manipulator, as the guy for which there is no boundaries and is willing to spy on opponents and so on and so forth. That's not the guy who's in 1960 up against JFK. So I was hoping you could talk about that for a second.
Yeah, Richard Nixon, his core belief was that when it comes to running for office, the boys seek office to be somebody and men seek office to do something. And so he wasn't the type of person that says, I want to grow up and be president to be president. He wanted to attain the office to accomplish things. And because of the way he viewed political office and he viewed work, he didn't believe in politics that you should make personal attacks on people. He believed that you could attack them rightly for their policy beliefs and their voting record, for example, but that, like with John Kennedy had a lot of back issues and had been in traction and had various treatments through the 1950s that Richard Nixon was quite well aware of because he visited John Kennedy in the hospital. He was pretty friendly with him, and he also knew that John Kennedy's Catholic religion was an issue in the 1960 campaign, but he absolutely forbade people from making any issue out of John Kennedy's health or his religious beliefs because those were not policy issues. And it's interesting because when John Kennedy was in the primary against Lyndon Johnson, he made a big issue of Lyndon Johnson's prior heart issues. And so, Kennedy was willing to do something, and Nixon wasn't willing to do the same thing because he did not believe that it was appropriate to attack somebody on personal issues. He felt that you have to separate personal issues from policy issues when it comes to running. And he really showed that in that campaign, and people have attacked him for his various campaigns, but if you actually look back at those campaigns, he never did engage in the personal attacks. He always stuck to policy.
Yeah, and boy, wouldn't that be a breath of fresh air nowadays? Things have changed a little bit if you're not aware, but. So he's not going to do the personal attacks, and he's trying to do something, Nixon, in 1960, that's hard if you look back over American political history, which is he's trying to maintain power with one party passing it off from one president who served 2 terms to someone who's going to serve another. That's hard. It doesn't happen very frequently in American politics. So what is Nixon's strategy then going into this 1960 campaign?
He really felt that if he campaigned against in all 50 states, that he would carry the day. And a lot of people think that he made a miscalculation by making a promise to campaign in all 50 states because it spread him too thin in trying to make sure to cover all 50 states rather than cover states that he needed to spend more time in. But one thing that is really interesting about the 1960 campaign, especially in comparison today, is, and it really is reflective of Nixon and his idea of service over self. Once John Kennedy won, and by the way, John Kennedy, wins what is the closest election in our history, and there was actual evidence of fraud, and especially in Chicago and Texas, that was done in favor of the Democrat Party. There was an author named Earl Mazzo, who was a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, and he started doing a 12-part series talking about the election fraud that he personally was uncovering. And he had affidavits and different proof demonstrating the thousands of votes that had been mistallied. And we're talking about an election that was so close that if you change one vote per precinct, it changes the outcome of the election. So this idea of thousands of votes really is a substantial issue. And Eisenhower wants Nixon to challenge the election results. Eisenhower's cabinet offers to raise the money to underwrite the legal challenge, and Richard Nixon called up Earl Mazzo, and he invited him to lunch in early December. And Earl Mazzo spent about 45 minutes outlining all this election fraud that he had uncovered. And Richard Nixon told him that's really interesting. And then Richard Nixon spent about 45 minutes talking about democracy in America and how there was all these fledgling democracies throughout the world that were looking to America as a beacon of light for those countries pursuing democracy, and that America doesn't have fraudulent elections, and that he needed Earl Mazzo to kill his 12-part series, and that he wasn't going to challenge the election. And Earl Mazzo, basically he said, I thought I was a goddamn fool. And he refused to kill the stories. So Nixon went to his publisher and had his publisher kill the stories. And then Nixon had if you think about Mike Pence and what he went through in the last election, Richard Nixon was in Mike Pence's situation and had to certify the election in favor of John Kennedy because he said it's in our country's best interest to not have, a weak president for a year when we're in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and too many countries depend on our democracy. And it really is reflective of this person who always grows up with the idea of service over self and all of his community service. And like you had mentioned earlier, he wasn't just checking a box to obtain an office later. It was a way he was living his life, and he believed it was in our country's best interest, although it probably wasn't in his best interest. And he undertook the high road, which would be interesting to see today on many levels.
Yeah, sometimes things change over time, but I thought it was an interesting, if you really, and you make a great point, if you really want to look at an election where there's real evidence of fraud, the 1960 election is where you need to go and no further. And he makes this calculation that, listen, the overall health of the United States is more important than anything that I would do right now as president of the United States. And he takes a pass on it. And I think that tells us a lot about him. And when we come back to Watergate at the end, I'll just ask about that. But he walks away. He does not challenge the election. So what does he do after that?
He returns to Southern California and he starts practicing law. And there's an interesting dynamic that went on through California during the period of Nixon's vice presidency, which is that in terms of the powerful California politicians, you have Earl Warren, who's governor of California. You have Goody Knight, who's his lieutenant governor. And you have Bill Nolan, who is the senator from San Francisco. And they're all strong Republicans. And Bill Nolan's family, I believe, owned the San Francisco Chronicle. And powerful California families. Well, Richard Nixon's elected vice president. Earl Warren is appointed to the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Goody Knight is elevated to the governorship, and Bill Nolan is president of the Senate by 1952, or as a result of the 1952 elections. In 1958, the Republicans were no longer in control of the Senate. Bill Nolan was no longer president of the Senate, and he wanted to advance his career, so he decided to run against Goody Knight for Goody Knight's governorship. Rather than defend his seat, Goody Knight decided to run for Bill Nolan's Senate seat. And the voters did not appreciate the swapping of seats there, and the Republican Party fractured over what these guys were doing. And it allowed the Democrats to sweep all the offices in California in terms of the statewide offices. And so then you have Nixon lose 2 years later to Kennedy, and he returns home in January of 1961 to start practicing law. And the Republican Party comes to Richard Nixon and says, "You're the most powerful Republican in California. You're the only guy that can heal this party in this state, and we need you to run against Pat Brown for governorship, and in doing so, unite our party." But really what is fascinating about that election is Richard Nixon said it's the one time in his life that he ran for the office and not for the to accomplish something. And he was doing it to help heal the party and to obtain the office. And in doing it, because of the voting registration in California, the Democrats had about $1 million or a million voter increase over the Republicans. And so the only way Richard Nixon can win is if he gets every single Republican to vote for him and 1 million Democrats. In 1962, the John Birch Society is a big issue in California, and the leader of the John Birch Society basically despises Eisenhower and is highly critical of Eisenhower. And Richard Nixon is very fond of General Eisenhower, and he's very opposed to the John Birch Society. And the only way that he can unite the Republicans is if he doesn't make the John Birch Society an issue. Instead, he declares that he will not support any Republican running for office that is affiliated with the John Birch Society, and that Republicans had to make a decision that they were either going to be Republicans with him or they were going to be with the John Birch Society. And so he undertook a course where it was impossible for him to unite the party, but he did it because it was the right thing to do morally, and he did it knowing what the outcome was going to be, and the outcome was that he lost. And it's again, it goes back to this whole idea of putting the population in the state of California first, where it was in everyone's best interest to not be a proponent of the John Birch Society, and he refused to do it.
Yeah, so just another example of him putting sort of the best needs of the population as a whole ahead of himself time and time again. Well, we're getting close on time, but I do want to jump forward and ask a Watergate question or two. And I'm not as much interested in sort of the machinations of what happened up to and leading to the Watergate scandal. What I'm interested in, and the question that's always been interesting to me, is when we look at Richard Nixon's legacy, the first word that everybody brings up is, of course, Watergate. But I've always wondered Richard Nixon's decision to resign, which was not necessarily supported by all of his friends and family. Shouldn't he get some credit for doing that? Because again, it strikes me as a decision that I'm not going to put the nation through a contentious, potentially painful impeachment hearing that I may win. Instead, I am going to put the needs of the country first and resign. I've always thought that he should get a little bit more for that than he has gotten, but I'm not sure. What do you think about that?
It's very interesting because if you look at his presidency, in 1968, our country was so divided. We were at war in Vietnam, and we had people, fleeing to Canada to avoid service. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and Richard Nixon's elected, but he's not elected on a majority. He's elected on a plurality. And at no time during his presidency did he have a Republican House or a Republican Senate. Yet He's the first president to go to Moscow. He's the first president to sign a nuclear arms reduction treaty. He ends Vietnam. He does the all voluntary military. He believes that clean air and clean water are birthrights of every American citizen. He creates the EPA, and he introduces the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. All 5 of the manned moon missions that landed on the moon were during the Nixon presidency. He signs Title IX into effect, fundamentally changing women's sports. He brings women into government. He quadruples the amount of women in management and government. And he, for the first time, you have women that are Secret Service agents and FBI agents and tugboat captains and forest rangers. And he really opens up the government to women. He tried to appoint Mildred Lilly to the United States Supreme Court as the first woman, and the American Bar Association voted 11-1 to say she's unqualified. She happened to be a Democrat, and she was the longest serving justice on the California Court of Appeal. She was eminently qualified. And he does all of these things, opens China, and has a tremendous domestic agenda as well, and is incredibly successful. He wins re-election in basically the second largest landslide in our history, 520 electoral votes, 96.6% of the Electoral College. And then you have Watergate. And the House and the Senate are opposed to him because he's never had a Republican House or Senate. And he knew he couldn't accomplish anything more. And so instead of putting us through the long docket of Watergate and a fight for his own self-interest, he walks away from it. And what really I find fascinating about him as an attorney, where people come to me and tell me things all the time, and then I have to go look at the evidence. And if you look at him, he has this recording system, which is recording everything that he's doing. He knows he has the recording system. He knows what they've said on the tapes. I'm sure he doesn't remember all of it, but he's the one that's aware of it all. And once it comes out that he has this taping system, everyone told him, burn the tapes on the White House lawn, like have a bonfire, destroy everything. And he doesn't. He refuses to. Then they subpoena the tapes. He fights them in court, but he doesn't destroy anything. He doesn't do anything to hide anything other than do the court battle. He loses the court battle, then he gives them the tapes. And the tapes are what are used to then bring the impeachment charges against him. And that preservation of that information, which is not going to be beneficial to you, really shows fundamental honesty above all else. And then the willingness to say it's in our country's best interest to not have a president on the dock again, for a year in a fight over this. It's just not in our best interest with everything going on in the Middle East, with what was going on with the Soviet Union. It's service over self. And it's so fascinating to me that for so long, people have used these things against him to villainize him when all of the evidence has been right in front of us as to it actually demonstrating the quality of his character.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. What I saw when I was reading, the latter chapters of the book was someone who was behaving consistently throughout his entire life. He had always put these moral questions first. And the fact that you bring up about the reality is that he could destroy the evidence. That would be probably the only plausible way that he goes down for this. And he doesn't do it. And that tells us so much about him as a person. You have to be very committed to honesty to say, I'm going to be the first president to resign the presidency at this point under threat of impeachment. And, I think that tells us a lot. But really, my takeaway from the book was that Richard Nixon, he's far down the list of U.S. presidents oftentimes, but I don't know that that's necessarily fair. And I also think he's done so many other things, not just as president. He did a lot as president, as you mentioned, but he did a tremendous amount as vice president. He did a tremendous amount, both in his time in the House and the Senate. He did a tremendous amount for the party. He did everything, and that I think he should get some more credit for that. Well, we're running out of time. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I find that what's most interesting about Richard Nixon is we have to answer the question, is he a villain that got his just desserts, or was he an all-American man that had this incredible life but made an incredible miscalculation for which, his legacy is stained? And from the evidence that I have seen, he is not a villain, and the continued villainization of him really says more about us as Americans than it does say about Richard Nixon. And we should really evaluate him and his life in full, and all of the accomplishments, the ups and the downs.
Yeah, in many ways, he's a very tragic figure in sort of even just his arc and his life, where one maybe mistake, one character flaw was the thing that brought him down in the end. But I think some reevaluation is important, and I also agree with you. I think sometimes it does say a little bit more about us and how we behave nowadays than anything that Richard Nixon actually did. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a wonderful conversation. It was a great book, and I have every desire and belief that it's going to do extremely well.
Thank you so much. It was great speaking with you. I really enjoyed it.